Hello and welcome to this panel. It's an honor for me to be here with you all, and we have a very interesting discussion this afternoon. First, I want to introduce my panelists. Thank you so much for agreeing to being with us today, and I'm sure we all can learn from this. First, we have Dan Bartlett, President and CEO of Hill & Knowlton USA, and Chairman and CEO of Public Strategies. We have Admiral Bob Inman, Chairman of the Board, Massey Energy Company. I'm sure many of you know him. And lastly, but not least, we have Sol Trujillo, former CEO of Telestra, Orange and US West Director, Target Corporation, Wind Telecom, and WPP. Please give them a grand round of applause. When we talk about crisis management, many things come to mind. Lately, we've seen it in the news. It can be from an oil spill, we are aware of it, mining disaster, a huge lawsuit. We have many things that come. And when it comes to a corporation, it's a time that they have to handle the situation and also all the questions that arise from it. Media gets involved, of course, once, right? I see those smiles. And from the corporation side, let's talk about the first rule that each and every one of you follow in the role that you play in your corporation, in your organization, to handle crisis at this point.
Tell the truth.
Yeah, I think from a CEO perspective, telling the truth and being full disclosure and out front is absolutely imperative. And we can talk about recent examples in Japan, recent examples with BP and other what I would call well-publicized situations where maybe that wasn't quite the case. And you have lots of fallout, and you're spending more time chasing all the loose marbles than trying to deal with just one.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I might have one little turn on telling the truth, which is first and foremost, you must seek the truth. Yes. And get the truth. And I served in the White House for 7 years, from 2001 to 2007. That was a time of probably continual crisis, if you think about it. We had 9/11, in which I was on Air Force One with President Bush on that day. We had anthrax attacks in our own country. We had military campaign in Iraq, Afghanistan, a shuttle disaster. Vice President Cheney actually shot somebody, if you remember that. That was an interesting crisis. Katrina, and then the financial crisis that gripped the entire world in 2009. And what I have found in almost every single one of those is that one of the attitudes and sometimes advice that is given is that you got to get out there quickly. And the rush to be out there first oftentimes makes you go out without good information. And you cannot have a sound crisis management strategy without the proper information. Sometimes that's hard to discern in the middle of that crisis. In Katrina, we had a problem where we were not getting good information from the front lines. So it was then hard to make decisions based on that. And so the truth is very important. I often say sometimes you have to tell the truth slowly because you have to wait until you have all the facts. And so that is a challenge I think is facing, is that in the immediate environment that we live in which we're no longer talking about a 24-hour news cycle, we're talking about a 24-second news cycle. There's such a high demand to be out there first. In a situation like we find the Japanese, particularly with the nuclear plant, they went out early and tried to downplay it, and now they're paying the price for that. And so going out fast but accurately is really important.
You have the opportunity to work with both the government and the private sector. So right now, what will you advise your clients What's the first rule of thumb that you will tell them, this is what you got to do?
Well, it obviously depends on the situation. I would say that what I find typically in the case in corporate America is that they're not properly organized to handle a crisis. I thought that the federal government was bureaucratic and risk averse. Unfortunately, I've found not all companies, but many companies in the Fortune 500 to be very siloed, very risk averse, oftentimes not prepared for when the Klieg lights are on and they're put under the spotlight and intense focus. And so most of the time what we try to do is before we go out and try to articulate the position of the company is to internally organize themselves in a way to where you can get good decision making based on pulling together the best information.
What about you, Admiral? I mean, from a board of directors point of view, because we have all these different perspectives when it comes to crisis, how will you manage it?
Board of directors has an even more difficult problem often in getting information. It flows through management to the board. And you have to be very careful as you reach in that you don't end up micromanaging the company. So creating the climate that encourages people to tell you what's going on. Ever since I first became a manager, I've always told people who work for me, I don't like surprises even for my birthday. I take bad news calmly if it comes from the person responsible for it, because you're already halfway on your way to a solution. They know they've got a problem, they brought it to you, they're looking for advice. I am far less patient when I find somebody's tried to cover up their problem and not surfaced it in the process. So from the board, you are dependent on the chief executive officer and on senior management. Hopefully you will have had dialogue before you ever get to the crisis of the kind of flow you want. The board is a group of people. And one of the challenges in any kind of a crisis, who's going to be the spokesman? Who's going to be the spokesperson? And are they credible? So for those of you here at lunch, wonderful advice on credibility along with integrity in the process. But if you haven't thought that through and you aren't prepared, the crisis is going to be a lot worse when you're having to try to figure out who's going to be the spokesperson to the media, to the government, to whomever else has an interest.
So you were saying integrity, credibility, of course, seeking the truth if you don't know it yet. Anything else that you will advise people? What's the first rule that you must follow?
I'm mindful of the caution that Dan put on the first answer. Be sure you know the truth. Patience. Patience is not one of the virtues that I got a lot of to start with in the process. But you really do need patience to give people time to assemble and understand the facts. And you need to have patience in understanding why they acted as they did at the circumstances whenever the crisis came along.
I guess I would like to kind of take it a little bit to the side here on the conversation about telling the truth, because I think Dan offered the right caution, which is make sure you know what the truth is. And the problem is that people seek answers in what I call a real-time world. I've lived in the technology side of things. I've helped bring, all the technologies to market over the last 20 years or so. And so we're real-time. So the issue of telling the truth is telling the truth as you know it at that point in time. And letting people know you don't have everything at your fingertips. You don't know all the details. But given where we are today, this is the truth. Because in a real-time world, what happens if you don't lead, in my opinion, quickly, other people will create truths. And there will be many, points of speculation that then you not only have to worry about what's the right truth, but then you have to deal with all the other truths that get created based on speculation. And I would say that this has very relevant attributes for each of us as individuals. You know, when you were little, you got caught doing something, your parents asked you, you know, what happened? You had that moment where you kind of decided to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, as you knew it, or to fudge a little bit. And generally, once the fudging starts, it gets pretty slippery, and over time, ultimately, the truth comes out. So that lesson is relevant in business. It's relevant, I think, in the public sector. It's relevant in any sector. So having that mandate that says you always start with the truth as you know it, disclose it right away, take control, and I guess I would say as a CEO, you always need to make sure there's a chain of command. You know, when Dan talks about silos and all kinds of things that happen in companies, you know, in crisis, people are looking for leadership, period, end of story. And somebody has to make calls, somebody has to make decisions. And being clear on that up front, and for me, I've always felt that as a CEO, that, you know, you can have people designated and all that, but at the end of the day, you're accountable. That in a public company context, there's only one person that is accountable, that has the duties, the responsibilities defined, and it's the CEO. Now, the CEO reports to a board, and the board has oversight responsibilities, and they are fiduciary duties, but they can't be, you know, day-to-day knowledgeable. Many times, people don't know the details of a company and its operations and why you put a platform out in the Gulf and how deep it was and who was the supplier and all that sort of thing, because that's not your expertise. So you have to trust management, and you trust management and you create the context that says no surprises, up or down or sideways should be the rule, you know, the ruling principle in terms of operation.
So you were saying disclose it as you know it, or in some cases it can be disclose it as you want people to know it. I mean, Dan, give us an example. I mean, you've been with the private sector and also the public sector with the government. So many lessons maybe to learn. Something that you might learn with the government that now it can be applied to corporate America.
Well, I think one thing that politicians and those in politics understand probably more acutely than in the corporate world is that there are multiple audiences and multiple stakeholders. They know that because they're always constantly trying to understand where their different constituencies are, because they're always trying to rely upon them to get elected again. And so they've got a finger on that pulse of multiple stakeholders and audiences. When I find in corporate America, what happens, and it only gets exacerbated during a crisis, is that they're probably really good on speaking to certain parts of their public, like maybe their customer or their shareholders, but then they find themselves being woefully inadequate in speaking to, for example, their employees, who I view as not a private matter, but a public matter, because employees now increasingly are the tip of the spear of a company's reputation. And if your own employees don't understand what you're trying to accomplish as a company, particularly in a crisis, you have no way to get people outside of the business, the company, to understand what you're trying to do. I would add just one point to what Saul was saying about an org chart and structure. It's critically important to be an effective organization in calm times. I think what some people think is, well, when a crisis hits, we'll all throw in and collaborate and we'll be great. Actually, it's just the opposite. A dysfunctional org chart only gets worse during a crisis, not better. And trying to reform it on the fly during a crisis is impossible. One thing I found that is very important, and usually companies don't realize this until they come out of a crisis, is that at the end of the day, what you're trying to get more than anything else when you enter into a crisis is you're looking for the benefit of the doubt. You want the public, or whomever it may be, to say, I'm going to pause just for a minute, just for however period of time, and to think about it before I pass judgment. And the reason why you do that is because if you can build up enough goodwill with the audiences and stakeholders that matter, to where they'll say, yeah, I know I just heard that on the news about this company, but I know something different about them. And I know something that it's more, that speaks to the integrity of the company or speaks to the integrity of the people leading that company. The problem is that oftentimes companies ignore that proactive part of building that goodwill with key people, key stakeholders in the sphere of their operations. And so what happens, they attempt to do it in the middle of the crisis. And it's and it's too transparent and it's too transactional. People know what you're doing. You're doing it from a position of weakness, not strength. And so the one thing I'd say is that the best way to prepare for a crisis is to strategically identify who are those people who are going to, for lack of a better word, grade your papers and build those relationships before the crisis hits in the first place.
Admiral, how will you apply it when you were chosen as the spokesperson for Massey Energy? At that tragedy last spring, 29 people died, and you were on the spotlight. How do you handle it?
With difficulty. I'm reflecting on our previous conversation and this one in answering. The reality is that you won't always get it right the first time. Bad news does not get better with age. That's another standard line I would give you in this process. And the quicker you can correct if you've made a mistake or if you've put out information that's not accurate. It's very important, in fact, building trust. And the biggest problem that I had, frankly, at the outset after the explosion, first, only fragmentary information about what had actually gone on inside the mine. Trying to reconstruct what actually happened, process, still an ongoing process, because the ones who really knew are all dead. Second, the media inclined in that circumstance to accept the worst, any allegation. And the issue becomes pretty quickly, do you try to counter every inaccuracy? Or do you stand back and try to build your own narrative of what you believe occurred over time? And then you set out to rebuild integrity and credibility a block at a time in the process. In our case, it was first, the things we couldn't change the nature of the investigation. So it became dealing with issues about corporate governance. And then it became, once you'd gotten that done, then it transferred to issues everybody, practically in the coal business, either wanted to buy us or part of us or to sell themselves to us and their management team. What the board circled around the longest, and probably with the least effectiveness, was this issue of who's the spokesperson. CEO wanted to be the spokesperson, didn't want anybody else doing it. The best coal operator in the business, but he would acknowledge also one of the worst people speaking back. So the end result turned out, we found the young general counsel was concise, direct, but people came to trust him. And he ultimately, over time, became the most effective spokesperson as we steadily began to rebuild some credibility. Hard to do it when the media has already prejudged cause and outcome. And if you're looking around for somebody giving you a pass or an easy thing, doesn't happen in a crisis. Rebuilding trust is a very slow process that takes a lot of work.
Talking about that, I mean, at some point you suggested that the non-union workers, how is the government really related? I mean, when you make all these statements, and of course you have to deal with stakeholders and all this, that is just one thing, come up front and talk to the media. And of course you were saying building back trust, it takes a lot.
Well, the reality is you're often not playing on a level playing field. And if the media is focused entirely on the company and not on the regulatory authorities, and take any leak that comes out of the regulatory people making sure they're trying to clear their own skirts, then you have a very difficult issue. Do you confront your regulators? And if so, how? That's not a simple, easy judgment, and there's a high price in the confrontation side. The fact that the media accepted a constant stream of leaks from the regulatory body without ever challenging the accuracy of their leaks was and remains to me an astonishing feature of this process, but it's also the reality of it.
Talking about media, is media biased against corporate America? What will you say? Briefly, I know you might have a lot of things to say, but...
I'll let you take that, so.
Well, you know, I think to some extent it is, and you know, real journalists are I think in the old days trained to be somewhat skeptical, meaning skeptical that you can't just accept things at face value. Just because somebody says something doesn't mean it's right. You have to do a little bit of research, you have to do some fact checking, you have to do all that. And then what happens is over time, and I would say in the corporate world, people have gotten so busy with spin that, you know, then all of a sudden the media has to overreact in doing certain things to find a counterbalance. I would say there's a little bit of that. At the same time then, in the US in particular, but I'd say it's evolving in the rest of the world, having now lived in every quarter of the kind of the economic world. What's also happening is that every country has become very partisan. So here in the US, we talk about Democrats and Republicans. And so now we're to the point where we have media that are essentially Republican media or Democrat media. And there's very, you know, to be quite frank, I can't name a media source that I would call truly independent, that you wouldn't find that you could predict what their positions are going to be on issues in advance. I mean, I just find it hard to do. I'll give you an example. In Europe, when I was running Orange, which is a large, at that point in time, was the second largest wireless company in the world, I was headquartered in London, but I was spending a lot of time in Paris. And you know, when you go to, I go and fix companies, turn them around, et cetera, and you work a lot of hours. So at the end of the night, it was about the time that the US had entered into the Afghan-Iraq conflict. So I found myself as an American always, you know, defending what we were doing, et cetera. But to get real truth, I would go to my room and I would turn on the TV and I'd start with TF1, which is the French station. I'd turn over to the BBC, since I was living in the European quarter at the time. I'd turn over to the BBC and get a version of what the news was. I'd turn it to Al Jazeera to get a version of the news. Then I would turn it to a US network, whether it be ABC or CBS. And then I would turn it to Fox. And if you were sitting in the room with me every night, you would have seen a different war 5 different ways in terms of how the news was, quote, factually being reported. And each one would attest, we're factual, we're unbiased, we're, you know, whatever. But the story, I mean, every night I'd go back and you know, this is about 1 in the morning, and I'd be turning on all these stations, and it was just amazing. Well, what's happened now is that there is this skepticism, there is this bias, but it's based upon what your orientation is and what your business objectives now are in the media, because the media is now much more business, you know, what I would call traditional business centered in terms of driving viewership, which drives revenues, which drives earnings, which drives everything. And therefore, you have to cater to certain audiences. They've segmented the audiences They know who they can drive, the best revenue and earnings performance from, and they play to it. So there is a natural bias. That's not a criticism, that's just a factual kind of statement from a non-media person. The final thing that I'd say is that, every company, every individual, though, creates that form of goodwill. And I think Mr. Inman here said it right. There's no company that's perfect. There's no individual that's perfect, and we all will make mistakes. The question is how do you build a preventive strategy that says you build a lot of goodwill doing lots of different things. And you also have, as Dan was saying, a defensive strategy that says when you do screw up, which you will, doesn't mean you're bad, doesn't mean you're stupid or anything else, it just means those things happen, you have a ready to execute plan. And that way you can deal more factually, more unbiased, with those who may have a bias of some sort.
Leslie, if I may pick back up something on the point of view. When I first really began interacting with the media, it's in the 60s and 70s, primarily print, and with editors-in-chief and managing editors that spent a great deal of time checking the accuracy of the information they were going to produce. That's what I find absent in today's media world, because it moves so fast. Less time to take the time to go back and check or cross-check. And there's no correction, or rarely correction, after the fact. So the first thing that gets out there, whether it's in the blogosphere or in the print side, that's accepted as fact and it's never corrected. So when they go back and reference it, the same mistakes still come back up. So what really worries me for the average individual trying to be informed, where's the fact checking, where's the correction on the media side when mistakes are made in reporting? Just as I feel a great responsibility on our side, business or government, to correct, I don't sense that same sense of responsibility on the media side today.
I would just add, I think probably people think I'm knee-jerk would say that the media is biased. There's definitely partisans as far as, or at least persuasions on the ideological spectrum, as far as Fox News maybe being on one end and New York Times or MSNBC being on the other end. I must say, on even the worst days in the White House, reading the vicious press out there, I'd always comfort myself by reading the British press, which was even more vicious, and saying it could be that bad. But the only thing about the British press is they're actually more transparent about who they support. There's a Tory paper, there's a Labour paper, and they're much more transparent, at least to say where their motives are. Whereas, the New York Times and others try to cloak it behind, we're fair and balanced, or we're, all the news fit to print. I do actually think there's another bias that overrides even the partisan bias, and that is the business bias of a news organization or of a reporter wanting to be, they're looking for one thing. They want to be on the front page of their paper, or they want to lead the evening news. The Obama administration is just as frustrated with the media as I was when I was there. It is the conflict, it's the race to be first and to be most promoted, to get out there. And that's where some of the looseness comes now, because of the pressures of the news cycle being compacted so much. I'd also think Saul's right on an interesting point about technology, though. And I think, when we look at this kind of systemic partisanship, and that's what I call it, it really is systemic. I think, and we won't get into a big story, dialogue about redistricting, but I think it plays a big role. But I think technology, while it has been incredibly transformative as a consumer, I mean, if you think about it, when Ronald Reagan ran for re-election in 1984, 72% of the American people got their news from ABC, CBS, and NBC. When we entered into the White House in 2000, only 42%. So this great proliferation of news and information, and our ability to consume it when and how we want. We don't have to tune in at 6:30, and we can download your broadcasts and those things on our iPhones and those things. But in politics, what has tended to take place, I think, is that because this information is so accessible, we tend to go to places that reinforce our views, not test our views. Right. And so each side kind of says, well, I've got to go to my blog or to this place for that, so to get my talking points. So if you're on the right or if you're on the left, you run to this place. You get your worldview based on people you trust, and the people you trust have similar political views. You get your talking points, and we kind of meet in the middle and clash. And so as much as it's been great for us as consumers, I actually think it has contributed to some of the hardened partisanship and political discourse we seem so disgusted with today.
Ken, if you don't mind, I'd just like to add to Dan's point, and I think this is a message for all of you. I think as you think about your roles, whether it be in the private sector, public sector, nonprofit sector, and you think about leadership, you really do need to make sure that you're looking at as much of the data, as many views as possible, so that you can form your own opinion, as opposed to adopting the opinion of somebody that perhaps you enjoy, you know, the venue and their philosophy or leanings, but that doesn't make you a leader. Leaders listen. Leaders have open ears. Somebody once explained to me that, young in my career, because I was an aggressive guy and all that sort of thing, and they said, Saul, just remember one thing. You have two of these, and one of these. So make sure you use them in proportion. And you know, I always remind myself sometimes when I have a strong belief about something, that I just, you know, to take a step back, make sure you're looking at as many avenues as you can, because that's going to make you more convinced, more powerful, more knowledgeable in terms of what you do.
If I may add, I mean, I know it's a reality what you all say, media bias, but it also depends on each newsroom and the journalist. Me as a journalist, I have a compromise with myself and with my community. First and foremost, inform the truth. And my job right there will be to go and ask the questions that maybe some corporations, organizations, politicians won't like, but I'm gonna go and ask the question and get my facts and get, every story has two sides, and sometimes three, and sometimes four. That happens. But now that we are talking about that, can it be overcome? I know you guys have mentioned a couple of points, but what can media do to overcome this, or we as a society?
Well, I tend to think that they have competing interests, because most of them are businesses that are trying to make a profit and respect their shareholders. And then there's the public good as well. And sometimes you fear that those two things, so as they try to cut expense, bureaus and budgets get cut, and therefore the researchers, the editors don't have as much resources to spend time. But these things are cyclical, I believe. We're going through an interesting time where it's not just the media, the institution of the media, a traditional institution like that is being questioned. Many of our traditional pillars or institutions in our life right now are being questioned. Government, I mean, politicians have terrible approval ratings. Corporate America, particularly financial institutions, are being questioned. The media, and even societal. Look at what the Catholic Church is going through, for example, and questioning the veracity of the leadership in the church. And so I actually think this great phenomenon that we have seen in social media, where we just made it, I think, last week, where half of the population of America over the age of 12 has a Facebook account. I mean, if Facebook has a population, we're a country, it'd be the third largest country in the world. And the notion of it is just everybody's congregating here to gossip with their friends and things like that. But what we're finding more than that, one of the fastest growing segments of that population are women between the age of 40 and 55. And what I'm seeing though is that people are going to places where they think their interests are aligned with others. And they're going there to make fundamental decisions in their lives about the education of their children, where they want to go to school, you know, financial information. They're going to places where they think they have somebody else on the other end who is aligned with this. And right now they are skeptical of the traditional pillars institutions and not trusting what they are telling them. So they're finding their own communities. And technology has enabled them to do that. And I think that breeds competition, which I think will help the traditional institutions to modernize, to whatever it may be, their particular issues. So I think this is it's a good development, and I think the competition that technology will provide for the proliferation of information, the places to go to get information, will circle back and make those traditional pillars stronger and better in the future.
I might just add a different dimension here, having lived, you know, in Europe and also the Asia-Pac corridor, and being a CEO that's had transactions, deals, other things, you know, events, you know, that are a problem, dealing with regulators and governments, all that sort of thing. So I've been as critical of the media as anybody that you'll find in any room anywhere in the world. So let me start with that as a preface. But for those that live here in the US, in spite of our frailties and some of the weaknesses, one of the strengths of a great democracy is that people can speak up, voice opinions, and do it with whatever biases or perspectives that they have. That is a great asset that we have here in this country. And you know, I've lived in what the world would call, you know, democratic countries, where half the media is owned by the government. It doesn't look like it on the surface, but they actually do financially own it and control it. And so the amount of discourse or debate that doesn't occur is almost shocking in what you would call democracies. And so again, you know, I think all of us, you know, having had the opportunity to live elsewhere, just understand that the core principles upon which we operate, although sometimes they seem disorganized, sometimes they're frustrating, that's what makes this country great at the same time. So it's, you know, the old story of, you know, on the one hand it's great and on the other hand it's a pain. Well, that's the story of most of our strengths and our weaknesses as individuals. And so I would say there's ways that we can improve it. I think Dan's point is really important, that the social media, the context of anybody can send any message out anytime, any image, anything, anywhere in the world, is something that's going to hold people more baseline truthful, because somebody will have some elements of truth to share at some point in time.
Admiral?
I'm reflecting on how the media is changing the economic model. That much of the print media finds itself in great difficulty. The depth of coverage, particularly international coverage, which has always been my intense interest, has sharply declined in the process. And in the inability to find a stable economic model to continue to provide that flow of data to us, we are less well informed. We sit in this sea of data that's flowing, but far less comfort, on my part at least, about the accuracy of what's there. What can I count on being valid? I only read unclassified media. Made a conscious decision when I came to the private sector 29 years ago, because I won't have to stop and say, now where did I read that or where did I know it? But I do read with a certain knowledgeable, that's plausible, that's not plausible, from years of experience at looking at it. That's getting harder because there's less hard data coming from sustained coverage of problems. I find the same thing in the business world that I found in working at the national security side. I have some new favorite newspapers, simply because I've concluded they do a better job of pursuing fact over an extended period of time. I was subject of a half page in the Journal earlier this week, and I said they were fair in the process. but it was also a process that evolved over several weeks of questions, discussion. It wasn't a quick run hit for reporting. So some of that experience runs counter to what I've been saying. My worry really is when events are moving fast and you're trying to decide, is that reliable information or not reliable information on which to make your decisions on how you react. And I think that's where it's a problem for the media industry broadly, not just for us as consumers.
Perfect. Well, let's leave the media side for a little bit, right? Let's talk about how far will good take you. So I know that you are very involved with the Target Corporation, and you are saying that you should always give back to the community. And Target is compromised. It says part of our profits go back to the community, to our consumers. Tell us about that.
Well, obviously, I shouldn't say obviously. I've been on the board of Target for almost 15 years. And it was, when I went on the board, Target wasn't the Target that you know today, because it was known as Dayton Hudson Corporation. It was known as a retailer of, you know, kind of a dry goods kind of stores in Minneapolis and Detroit and Chicago and other places. And Target was kind of, it's one of those discount stores. And obviously we've transformed the company, meaning management. I say we, I've only been on the board, so we get to help guide and direct and develop strategies. But part of what the founders of the company had a fundamental belief in was giving back to the community. So Target is, I don't know if it's the largest contributor in a community sense, but if it isn't, it's one of the top 2 or 3 in the country. It gives back 5% of its profits back into the community. And that's been a fundamental principle. Good times, bad times, you still give. It's like paying a dividend, except for not to shareholders, but essentially to your customers and their community. And I would contrast, and again, the companies I'm going to mention, or one in particular, you know, its primary competitor has been Walmart. And if you look at Walmart over the last 15 years compared to Target, Walmart is obviously the largest retailer in the world. And they've done very well in an economic sense, creating a lot of value for shareholders. But they've had a lot of issues that have happened over time because they were so busy focusing on how they grew. At the same time, you had Target that was on a path of growing, but always gave back. And so when we try to open stores in communities, you'll see people standing in line welcoming, city councils and all that. And when you see them opening stores, you know, big box stores, you'll see reaction. And you'll see opposition, you'll see a lot of things. Now, Walmart is a very good company, so please don't take my comments as Walmart not being a good company. But their emphasis on kind of corporate social responsibility, community giving, et cetera, has been different. And Target put their money where their mouth was and put it into education and a lot of different avenues. So as we've transitioned over time, it's had big payoff for us in terms of acceptance, over-skewing in terms of sales and margins and shareholder value creation over that 15-year period of time. So there's had a measurable impact in terms of the facility at which you operate a business, in terms of shareholder returns. And I would say then we built up a lot of chits in the bank. Now back to what I said a minute ago, Target's not a perfect company. You know, it's made some mistakes. And when it has had mistakes, it has a lot of reservoir of goodwill so that people say, well, you're a good company, you did make a mistake, and as long as you correct the mistake and you deal with it appropriately, then we'll kind of not judge you by an anecdotal event. And I won't get into details of them, but we've had some. And I think most of them we've been able to kind of manage through. and deal very well to your very point, which is if you do it right, if you do it for the right reasons, and it's not a mechanical bartering process. I'll be good in this community if I get this, but you just say, look, we're gonna give, good times, bad times. All of a sudden, you build up a much different perspective, and you have a lot of resources to draw upon.
May I take it from, I'm sorry, Dan.
No, go, please go ahead.
Take it from the institutional view to the individual view. All of us have been fortunate to have pretty successful careers, multiple careers in some cases. If you're honest with yourself about that success, you will acknowledge that a significant enabling factor in that success were people who took an interest in you, people who opened doors, people who gave you an opportunity to do things. It's very rare that you can repay that individual who opened the door, who gave you the opportunity. So for me, the responsibility is then go try to do the same for as many people who are coming along as you can. Advice, assistance, help. That's the only way you can repay those things that made your career possible.
Well, it's hard to stress the uniqueness of what Target does when it literally, on a weekly basis, gives 5% of its profits back to the community. I mean, you won't find that in the Fortune 500, really. I mean, it's truly unique. And he's right in saying that it has, vis-a-vis a fierce competitor, has given them some competitive advantage when it comes to siting of stores. And it is my challenge, and as full disclosure, my company does work for Target, so I get actually done work for both of these gentlemen's Target, and they are being very humble in their articulation of the role they play as board members. They're fantastic board members, and they provide fantastic strategic governance to the companies. You get somebody like Target who comes from those Midwestern roots, which are very humble. The humility in that management team is I don't think they do enough to tout that success and that charitable work and body of work that they've done to explain to people, because I think they could even build up more goodwill if people had, I mean, a lot of people don't know that they do that and what the work they're doing in the communities. And it's important not only for a proactive potential competitive advantage with a fierce competitor like Walmart, but if a crisis were to hit, and we have had a few things that popped up, that it comes back to what I said earlier, that benefit of the doubt. So when somebody hears some Target controversy of some sort, they say, well, wait a minute, that's not what I know about them. Not only are they cool and have trade sheet, the cool things in there, but they also do good things in the community. And to think about it strategically like that, far too many companies think that way or act that, more importantly, act that way. And so it is a distinguishing factor, and I think it's made it a competitive advantage for the company. And I hate to use the word leveraging, but I think it goes back to what I said about the siloed aspect of corporate America, is that oftentimes you'll find in companies is that the foundation work or the charitable work the company's doing is totally divorced from other parts of the work they're doing to build goodwill, and they're not, one hand doesn't know what the other hand's doing, or understanding how they can leverage that. I mean, one of the AT&T, for example, they know the importance of being involved in the community. That's why they support organizations such as this. That's why they understand that giving back, it's a full circle. And it's particularly important in industries that are heavily regulated, because politicians are always on the watch. Politicians always have their finger in their air, as I've said, looking to see where public opinion goes. And I find that regulated companies are far more attuned to and sensitive to what's happening in the communities, because they understand their bottom line of their companies are fundamentally impacted by what the government does or what politicians can do to them. And so I often tell quote unquote unregulated companies, you ought to act like you're regulated, because it'll bring out the best of how you engage the public, and it'll prepare you well for a crisis or put you in a better position to gain competitive advantage in your marketplace.
Well, gentlemen, I want to thank you for being here with us and sharing all these experiences, and I'm sure we all learn from them. Now, I'm going to open the floor for questions. We have about 20, 30 minutes, so anybody has any question?
Well, I'll just comment. I chair the Corporate Social Responsibility Committee for Target. But I've been on the board of Pepsi, I've been on the board of Bank of America, I've been on the board of EDS, I've been on the board of a lot of companies, and have been involved in similar committees. I would say that, to be quite frank, sometimes companies don't learn about the need for the competency until they do have a crisis. And some of the reason why it hasn't been a priority is because, like in the case of Target, they have been so preemptive in this giving strategy of building up goodwill that almost anything can be managed, without having reached crisis proportions. But I think in today's world, given again the technology that some of us are guilty of having brought to the world, in terms of real-time communications, the social networking, all that sort of thing, you do need certain new competencies that have not been embedded in companies, plain and simple. And I think that most board rooms are having those conversations today about what competencies do you really need to manage in this kind of real-time world. Because, Admiral Inman was just talking about, how it was 20 years ago, 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, minus the social networking aspects. You had SMSing. I mean, an overthrow of government in Philippines occurred about 8 years ago through SMSing, right? We saw it in Spain after the bombing when there was kind of the existing government that was going to be reelected, except for people didn't like how it was being handled, and there were some other issues, and they started a texting campaign to turn out the vote real time. So this dimension is relatively recent, and people are learning how impactful it can be. As you just saw in Egypt, as you just saw in Tunisia, Algeria, and a few other countries in terms of how organizing is occurring. So you have to think differently, which requires different competencies.
Go ahead, Dan.
Well, I was just going to say, I found it to be, looking at it, and correct me if I'm wrong, looking at corporate America, is that you're either in one ledger or the other. You're either in the revenue generating part of the business or you're in the expense part, nuisance cost of the business. And communications and in dealing with the public oftentimes was viewed as almost as a nuisance cost. I got to deal with it. We'll make a decision in the boardroom or in the manager C-suite. We'll call down to the 4th floor to the PR shop and we'll have them put out a press release. And because of the fragility of reputation that we see today, is that I see more and more boardrooms and CEOs treating communications as a strategic asset that actually accrues to your bottom line. Because frankly, when you put a valuation on a company, what else is goodwill accounting than the reputation of the management, how much a company is willing to be sold for other than the price of its assets? Is that goodwill accounting? It is, and I think more and more companies are being sometimes forced through crisis, but other times those with the foresight to say, this is a strategic asset, we need to, and then treat it as one. So that means we build the competencies, we train against them, we make sure we recruit the best talent in there, we give it the same time, energy, and focus as we would our litigation risk or other enterprise risks that you have to manage as a management team. So I think you're seeing a major shift going on in corporate America. So like I said, sometimes industries are being brought along by mining disasters or by platforms disrupting in the Gulf like BP. Others are doing it more because they see the competitive advantage in it. But I think it is increasingly being used as a strategic asset, not as a nuisance cost.
And if you don't mind, I want to say one more thing to extend the thinking. In the case of Target, and I don't think I'm disclosing anything inappropriately here, having come from the technology world, and knowing how it operates, we have changed our metrics. So in the old days, if you were on the board, you might get press clippings for the last week, the last month, for board members to see how, what's going on in the company around whatever your operating territory is. What we do now at Target is we get those, right? But we also monitor the social media. We literally have metrics of monitoring the social media. So we're very, what I call multicultural in terms of how we think about the media. And we're developing the skill sets, kind of understanding at the board level and also understanding to a large extent in management about there's a lot of areas where your brand gets touched, your brand gets affected. Sorry.
In every case, when you consider it core interest, you're looking for competence. What's the competence that you can bring to bear on that issue? And if you look at the issue of whether you have it in-house or you go outside for advice, you also have to factor in what's the career ladder. Do you, in fact, have the ability to offer a viable career for a specialty or field that's very important to you? You may decide in this, it's much better to contract for that advice or sphere in an environment where there is clearly a career path to go, as opposed to taking somebody to fill that function who gets tired after a number of years doing it, and it loses some of its fizz in the process. So I think you need to clearly understand what are the core elements you need to be successful. And then you decide of those what have to be inside and where do you look outside for advice, assistance, and that. But you have to have those relationships established before you get to the, if you wait till you're in the crisis to do it, you're in a world of hurt.
Particularly to BP, there's a couple things that made that fairly unique, and it goes to two different things I've already referenced. One was that the question about internal decision-making and internal the culture of the company. A lot of people at BP merged with Amoco here, and what we found with a lot of people I know working on this crisis, not my company, is that there was a real balkanization of the organization at the highest levels, the old Amoco guys here in the US versus the BP guys in London. And so there was a lot of the left hand not knowing what the right hand was doing as far as communicating with the public and those things. Secondly, we've talked a couple times about who's your messenger going to be and who has credibility. And this was a situation which the British CEO coming to the Gulf state communities to say he's going to win the hearts and minds of those people along the coast was not quite probably good judgment. More importantly, though, where I think they fundamentally made a mistake, this was a unique crisis in the sense of the role that the government was playing. And I think usually consultants like myself or others will come in and say, CEO's got to be out there, got to be talking, got to be sharing information. But we had a situation where the government was saying, we're in charge. Yet they wanted a convenient excuse on any given day to blame BP for something that didn't happen the way they thought it was going to during that crisis. And it was my strong judgment that as long as that leak was not fixed, is that there was really nothing that BP could say that was going to assuage or allay any concerns. And what I would have done, I would have taken the government up on their request to be in charge. And if I would have gone out, I'd had one press conference with the CEO and say, my sole responsibility is to stop the leak. And I'm going to do everything I can and stay up every waking moment until it's closed. The government is in charge. They have made that clear. We will provide real-time information to the government whenever, however they want it, and they will decide how it is then given to the public. Instead, I think they got themselves into this purgatory of who was in charge, who wasn't in charge. They were going out there saying things that turned out not to be true. They were making promises they couldn't keep of when they were going to plug it. They were doing things that I think exacerbated the problem and ultimately costing him his job. The fact that they didn't plug the hole didn't cost him his job. What cost him his job was the controversial remarks he made along the way. And he could have prevented all of that by saying, government's in charge. They got Admiral Thad Allen, great guy, know him personally. He's in charge. We'll give him all the information. He'll decide how it's shared with the public. And I think he would have saved his job had he not done that. But I think he actually had consultants like me saying, you need to be out there, you need to be down there, you need to show them that you're... I don't think anybody was going to give BP the benefit of the doubt or listen to anything they said until the hole was plugged. And I think they fundamentally missed that point. And they spent a bunch of money on advertising during that process, which I think was a waste. Until you, I mean, nobody, as long as all of the cable stations, they had that little, camera. And that's the other thing. That was what the mistake the government made. So the White House first hailed as a victory, who said, we forced BP to put a camera down there. I was like, well, now what have you done? You're letting the public be reminded every day that you haven't done the job you said you're going to do, which is plug the hole. And you're showing a very vivid picture of it. I think they should have taken the government up on that charge, allowed them to be the spokesman. They didn't have credibility until they focused on the substance, which was plugging the hole.
The best one, case some years ago, is Johnson & Johnson. Tylenol, tampering, question of drugstore, they simply recalled it all quickly. And they established public confidence by having done so. Then they worked their way through the problem. But it was the speed with which they knew it was going to be a financial hit. They took it. They demonstrated that they were moving as rapidly as possible to try to make sure there was not an ongoing threat to the public of tampered products.
And I do think that's the textbook case that all of us kind of go study what happened there. And again, it was in a different media environment. And in that case, the CEO made the decision on his own. He just told everybody, we're going to recall, we'll incur the expense, et cetera, et cetera. I would say, in a more recent context, looking for a positive, quasi-positive, because remember, the media is different today than at any point in time. So there's never going to be a perfect immediate response situation. I would say how Toyota handled their situation as measured by consumer attitudes, as measured by sales volumes, as measured by a lot of metrics after the fact now that we've kind of a year later, or whatever it is now, they had their dip where GM and Ford and Chrysler and others could take advantage, but they have come back pretty strongly in terms of how they've managed it, because they had a lot of goodwill built up about Toyota, the engineering, the quality, all that sort of thing. And they fumbled at the beginning of, was there really a problem, and if not, and whose fault was it, and all that. But finally, they took ownership and then just dealt with it. And I think, again, we all make mistakes. We all aren't perfect. The question is at what point in time do you decide what's real is real, and you go execute very, very well across all the sectors that you have to address?
And I find, so you may speak to this as a former CEO, is that when a crisis happens, the person who's usually on the staff that is driving the process more than anybody else is the attorney. And all they're looking at is litigation risk, liability. And so oftentimes the CEO at a very pivotal moment has to override the judgment of counsel, who are going to be incredibly conservative, not wanting you to admit anything even close, because what we're saying is the public's going to make you take a half step back before you can take 2 steps forward. You got to admit guilt. And that's just not in the DNA of a lawyer to allow you to do that. I mean, that's what they're being paid not to do. And so, and oftentimes people from the communication, they butt heads with them, because we know it, in order to get past this or get over this, is that you got to demonstrate contrition. You got to demonstrate acknowledgement of, but lawyers typically fight that really hard. And it takes a CEO who has the leadership qualities to say, I understand my litigation risk, but my reputational risk is even greater, and it's going to cost the company more than a lawsuit.
And I just to emphasize that point, I mean, Dan made a comment earlier about how politicians look at more segments and all that sort of thing, probably more adeptly than CEOs. And I would say, and part of the reason why is because there's no immediate accountability, right? You have an election down the road, you can do a lot of things in between, but as a CEO, you have shareholder lawsuits, you have customer lawsuits, you have all kinds of things that you're immediately having to deal with. And these are not little, matters. So there is that pressure, but at the end of the day, life is about doing the right things and making just kind of the right judgment calls. But I would also say that when it's a massive situation, the good news about technology, again, is that if it is massive in terms of you're going to incur a hit financially, it's easy to get a hold of the board, quick calls, quick, video calls, whatever, get the alignment to say, these are the facts as we know them, here's how it's going to affect us, and I need you all to support me when we go do this. And sometimes CEOs aren't, there's the bravado CEO that wants to take charge and be like John Wayne in the old movies, right? And then there's the CEO that can be a little more thoughtful by taking an extra 30 seconds, touching base, getting the support, and then having the full force of the company behind them. In the case of BP, I happen to know the chairman of BP very well. He's a friend of mine. I think all of us heard and were shocked at his comment when he came to the US and he was meeting with the president, and he said, we are concerned about the little people, right? And all of us went like this. I called him up and I said, Carl, do you understand, what you said? And, because he's Swedish, he's not, his primary language is not English. He wanted to display sensitivity, but he didn't have the right kind of advisors, helping him use the right phrase that would have also helped turn the tide, other than, we had the CEO that was insensitive, and now we had the chairman that was perceived as also.
And this is an increase as more and more companies are global and they're domiciled in other parts of the world, and they have a crisis in another region in which they don't, the language is not the first language, English is not their first language, or if it's vice versa and they're in another country. Toyota, that was part of their stumbling out of the gate, is that their Japanese CEO was reluctant to come over here and be under the clear lights because he couldn't, he didn't have a command of the English language. He could speak it a little bit, but not enough to be forceful or articulate. And that kind of contributed early on to some of their slowness coming out, is identifying who was going to be the spokesman for the company and those things. And I think increasingly, as companies are global and dealing in so many different markets and so many different issues like that, that's going to be a challenge for management teams and boards. No good deed goes unpunished.
We have a question.
Admiral, since you ran a national security agency, why don't you start?
There is no easy, quick answer. Again, it gets back to what preparation have you done in advance. President Carter made a decision after an incident had come up and we had interacted with the New York Times on the damage they'd done to intelligence sources and methods. He created a process where, and President Reagan continued it first year and a half, where editor, 7:30 in the evening, 8 o'clock, would call and say, will it be harmful if we say the following? And it required a very direct judgment and a response at that time frame. It worked pretty well, but the big factor was trust. And creating trust that you were not trying to suppress that which was embarrassing, but that you were dealing with things which had a real national security impact. I think in this current world of the social media, everything else, process that wouldn't work. There's no editor there. to stop and do the interaction. And as pointed out to you earlier by my colleagues, success in journalism is being on the front page with your byline.
First.
That's the first. And or being, a segment on major news outlet. And so in that environment, getting people to recognize what they're pursuing has a harmful downside. Harmful to the shareholders' interest in the company or the employees or both, or harmful to the government's national security interest. So it's gotten much harder to try to deal with it in this world than it was in the one in which I grew up.
What I would say is that doesn't give you the convenience to say no comment. Because what you do is leave doubt and suspicion about your intentions. And so I think one that I've tried to do is, if we can't talk about the specifics, whether, like I said, whether it be strategy for a company that doesn't want to give competitive advantage to somebody else in their industry, or whether it's more critical. We had, unfortunately, the New York Times, not a very successful track record of convincing them not to print certain things when it came to national security, is that you can craft some principles that says, while we can't tell you the specifics of this, these principles are guiding our decision making. We'll follow these, and whatever it may be, and at least give some parameters and some kind of guardrails to give the public a sense for how decisions are being made. And so that's much better than saying no comment, which I get almost it feels like an admission of guilt that you're doing something wrong. And so I think too often we say, well, it's just easier to say nothing. But I think you can find a middle ground to say, we can at least give the public a sense for how, and that's one thing where I think, where if you take the current crisis with Libya, and the reluctance for the president to come out originally, and then he came out, he's trying to form a set of principles that guided his decision in Libya. The challenge they're facing is now people are trying to apply those principles and say, well, why aren't you doing that in Syria? Why aren't you doing it here? Why aren't you doing it? So you got to be careful that you got to think about all that, how it can be used against you as well. But I think there are ways in which you can craft principles to protect sensitive information.
It's not something to be proud of, but I have, when I didn't want to answer the question, I've answered a different question that I knew they were going to be interested in, and they went tracing a different route.
You know that, right?
Right. Find your way.
And I guess I would only add that on financial information, the lines are pretty hard.
Yeah.
I mean, pretty clear, pretty bright. When you disclose, you have to disclose to everybody, so you cannot do an offhand interview with somebody and say something and assume it's going out to everybody. You have to let everybody know you're going to make a comment about something at some point in time. Otherwise, you open yourself up to, if you're a public company, a publicly traded company, you open yourself up to lawsuits because there's selective disclosures, and you never want to be accused of selectively disclosing.
Any quick closing comments?
Wish you great, good success in your careers.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you.